Hey guys, welcome to Wrestling Days and welcome to this review of Mr. McMahon, the Netflix docuseries. And honestly, I've got 22 pages of notes. This thing was absolutely epic. It touched on so many subjects, and I want to start by telling you if you should watch it or not, because that's the question, isn't it? I think a lot of people are going to be tuning into this video and they've only got one question on their mind, and that is it worth watching? Should I watch it? And my honest answer is yes. I think you should. It's hard to say as to whether you're going to actually learn anything, because if you are a die-hard fan that really knows the history of WWE, I don't think there's anything here that you're going to be surprised by. But what it does provide is constant context. Like, it is constantly telling you little stories that you may not have heard. It's constantly giving you opinions that you may not have heard. There's constant quotes coming from different people that you won't have heard. So even though the big talking points like the steroid trial or the Montreal Screwjob or the Benoit incident, right, or obviously the Janelle Grant stuff at the end, like, even though wrestling fans know about all of these things, there's a lot of material that is there around them and other little things as well. So I would say it was worth watching. I've just spent 6 hours watching it and I don't regret it. I thought it was done really well. I suppose the other question is, how does it portray Vince? I personally think that it portrays him as being quite cold. I think it portrays him as being business first, always. But that's the Vince that I expected. So it didn't really change my opinion of Vince. Like, I went in feeling quite uncomfortable about Vince because, of course, all the scandals, the allegations. And so I went in feeling quite uncomfortable about Vince, but equally, it's Vince. Like, he is the most important person in the history of wrestling. Without him, I wouldn't have the form of entertainment that I love the most. So it is a very complex relationship that wrestling fans have with Vince McMahon. And I don't think anything here really changed my opinion. I think if you go into this hating Vince, you'll come out of it hating Vince. If you go into this kind of with a warmth towards Vince, I think you'll still come out of it with a warmth towards Vince. But he is portrayed as business first and always. I think what was quite surprising for me was we really dug into his relationship with Shane McMahon, his son, and that was quite a surprise because we don't really dig into his relationship with Steph so much, and we really don't dig into his relationship with Linda at all. She is there, she is interviewed, but we don't really dig into their marriage at all, right? We do look back at how it started, but really, the family member we spend the most time on is Shane, and it's really interesting, really interesting. We touch on Owen Hart and his tragic passing, of course, all the Janelle Grant stuff at the end, the steroid trial, the ring boy scandal is mentioned. I mean, it's a lot of a history lesson in there. I mean, a lot of the history of WWE. So there's a lot of times where they're just showing the company growing, basically. But yeah, I think if you don't know everything about WWE and you think that you will learn some stuff, then you will definitely learn some stuff, because I have come away feeling like that was a worthwhile watch. And I'm someone that's watched WWE for over 30 years. So if I can come away thinking that I've not wasted my time, I'm sure many of you will come away feeling the same. So I've got little quick breakdowns of each episode, just little things that I tweeted out. My plan is, now that we've done a bit of an overview at the start, go through these breakdowns. Then we'll go episode by episode and we'll go through my 22 pages of notes, and I'll try and get through them as quickly as possible. I would not be stunned if this video ends up being 50 minutes, an hour. I mean, I really don't want to be going over an hour. So let's try and get through this as quick as we can. So episode 1 is called Junior, and it obviously is a history lesson. It kind of talks about Vince, the fact he was raised poor, which might be a surprise to people. The fact that he wasn't just handed WWF like many people believe that he was. He really had to put the shift in, put a work in. And I think what I learned here was the fact that his dad was quite cold towards him when they finally met up, even to the point where Vince thinks that his dad maybe didn't even want to see him succeed, because Vince actually bought the company off his dad, and the agreement was, I'm going to pay in installments, and if I miss a payment, then not only will you get the company back, but you can have all the money that I've paid you so far. And the question is asked, do you think your dad wanted you to make all of those payments, or do you think he wanted you to fail? And honestly, I think Linda is not sure about whether Vince's dad actually wanted him to succeed or not. So, I mean, there's people out there that think that Vince was just given the company. That is not true, right? He had to buy the company, and his dad seemingly was quite happy for him to not succeed in doing that. So yeah, Junior, it's a history lesson. It's a look back. It takes you from Vince joining WWF to buying the company from his dad, and then on to WrestleMania 1. There's a couple of lawsuits in here that get mentioned, but episode 2 teases bigger scandals. And episode 2 I thought was really good. Like, that I thought was a fine intro. Like, there's definitely bits in there, like we've mentioned, that I thought was noteworthy. But episode 2, scandal heavy. Steroids. Rita Chatterton, who, of course, is the female ref who had, allegations against Vince. We've got the Superfly, Jimmy Snuka scandal, gets kind of touched on briefly. The Ring Boy scandals, they all get mentioned. History mixed in as well. I mean, we are going from WrestleMania 2, and we kind of go forward 10 years to like 93, 94 now. So constantly we're moving forward, right? Some great footage. I mean, there really is some really interesting footage in there, and quotes. Thought that this was a step up from episode 1, sorry. Then we've got, and this story as well, which I really liked, which is Vince talking about how he managed to convince Andre to partake in WrestleMania 3. I really enjoyed that. It's not a very in-depth story, but he just says like how Andre was kind of off filming films, and he had to go up to him and say, look, come back, let's do one more thing. Let's do the biggest wrestling show that the world has ever seen. And he tells Andre like 90-odd thousand seats, and Andre just laughs at him, but agrees to come back. And as I said, it's only like 40-odd seconds long, but it was just a good little story. So, right, on to episode 3, and it's Screwjob, right? So back to the history lesson, and a step down from episode 2. I think episode 2 is really good because there's so many scandals, so much stuff to kind of hear Vince talking about, right? Here, it's the Montreal Screwjob. And honestly, this has been covered so many times. I've heard Vince's side, and yeah, I feel like every angle of this has been covered. Obviously, it's not only the Montreal Screwjob, like there are other things that are in there. There is a line where Vince says, a lot of times he says things different to what he's actually thinking. I've got the full quote, and it's really interesting, right? So yeah, this I'd say is the worst episode for me. The Mr. McMahon character is teased and arrives in episode 4. Episode 4 is titled Attitude. So it's mostly a look at the Attitude Era. The final 10 minutes is Owen Hart's death, and honestly, I found myself getting a bit angry at points. I found myself getting frustrated. It was heartbreaking, of course it is. I mean, honestly, they show the pictures of Owen lying in the ring. They're pictures that you can find online, but they're not pictures that really get circulated that much. They're actually pictures that I hadn't seen until a few years ago. And it's Owen after he's fallen and he's lying in the ring. I would say it's essential that you kind of view that bit, the Owen Hart bit, because they obviously talk about the accident. You hear Vince talk about it, and what frustrates me is there's no emotion in Vince's voice. He even talks about the decision to carry on with the show, and I kind of thought that he would say something like he was so busy that like he was trying to focus on Owen and focus on the family, focus on the situation. And I was really expecting some sort of answer like that, which is why the show continued, right? Because his focus was elsewhere. He wasn't worried about the show continuing. He was worried about Owen and the family and sorting that. That was his priority, not the show. That's not the answer he gives. The answer he gives is, you know, people came out to see a show, and thankfully the lights were not on when Owen fell, so they didn't see the incident, or at least they couldn't quite see like what had happened. So I wanted to make sure that, you know, we gave them the show that they came for, basically. And I found that a very frustrating answer, because I think I've always in my mind kind of justified that decision of carrying on with the show. In my head, I've always justified it as Vince was in shock and he was putting the family first. And I don't know, I just didn't quite get that impression from the answer that he gave. Plus also the fact that you are shown the blood on the edge of the ring where Owen had fallen. And they make a really good point in the documentary, like, you made wrestlers go out there and wrestle when they know that their friend has just passed away and his blood is on the edge of the ring. I mean, as I said, it, I think, will make you angry. It will make you frustrated. It's heartbreaking. As I've put here, it's essential viewing. There's not really a way that I can word it that's going to paint an accurate picture without you watching it. So that is one that you'll have to watch and make your own mind up on. But I just had a whole cocktail of emotions as I was watching that part of the documentary. A big step up this, not just for that bit, but like the whole thing I thought was a step up from episode 3. Then we have Vince talking about his favorite wrestler, who I already knew was Dr. Jerry Graham. Then here, episode 5, the family business. This is the best episode for me because this really digs into the family dynamic. This is where we see that Shane has always kind of struggled with trying to prove his worth to his dad. And you also kind of, it's quite interesting how Vince says that his father never kind of showed him much attention, showed him any affection. And you can tell that that is how Vince treats Shane as well. Like, Vince treats Shane the same way that his dad treated him. It's cold, it's heartless. And you can tell that Shane is affected by that. But we touch on Steph and like some of the stuff that like Vince wanted to do, and there's some interesting stories in there. So for me, the best episode I would say is episode 5. It's all about the McMahon family dynamic, loads of quotes, stories, and great insight. It's an amazing look at Shane's relationship with his dad. The timeline at this point now gets to ruthless aggression. And it says the final episode preview. So, you know, that kind of bit at the end that tells you what's coming next shows news coverage of the Janelle Grant lawsuit. So we know that Janelle Grant is going to be heavily featured in episode 6, but that's no great surprise. So episode 6 is the finish. And I just put, wow, we revisit the Shane and Vince relationship. I kind of thought that we had boxed it off, but we actually go back to it, right? And I think they try to put a nice bow on it as well. Kind of get the feeling that they try to make it like a nice story arc. But obviously, as they're editing that, I don't think they're prepared for what's about to drop. Maybe in their mind, this was going to be quite a nice finish. Like, they've kind of gone with Shane coming back and him being embraced and, you know, Vince being a bit upset because, you know, it's a real moment, a personal moment. I mean, we know that Shane would drop his foot in it, you know, with that Royal Rumble a few years after. So, like, I don't know, it's a bit cherry picked. That's how it feels. It kind of felt to me like we need a nice story. We need something that can have a nice beginning, middle, and end. Let's go with Shane and Vince because we can have that moment at WrestleMania 32 where after that match, Shane goes back in, he embraces his dad, and his dad's upset, and it's a lovely moment, and, you know, that'll show, like, you know, a bit of warmth, and maybe we end on that, and maybe that was going to be part of the original finish. But then, of course, the whole Janelle Grant stuff drops, and we go in a different direction. So, yeah, we revisit Shane and Vince. We also touch on the Benoit tragedy, and we talk about young wrestler deaths, because there's been a lot of wrestlers like Eddie Guerrero, of course, that have passed away young, and we go through like a whole list. Then there's 28 minutes on the lawsuits and the craziness of Vince retiring. Then don't forget he came back. And then, of course, he resigned in early 2024. Feels like ages ago that Vince resigned and was gone forever. But it was only earlier this year, which I was shocked at. I don't know why, but in my mind, he walks away like last year. But it was actually just before the Royal Rumble this year. So my brain had kind of remembered it a long time ago, much further back than that. So I think this was the second best episode in my opinion. And I just wanted to put a little something at the end for people. So I put, if you're open-minded, then watch it. It's very well done, like the whole series. Overall, it paints Vince as quite heartless and cold, certainly with the Shane stuff and the family stuff, right? He is a business-first guy. But that's the Vince I expected to see. So overall, I think this will still frustrate anti-Vince viewers at times. The reason I wrote that is because I think it's hard for me to know who I'm talking to. I could be talking to the biggest Vince hater right now, but equally I could be talking to someone that's the biggest Vince lover who just loves what he's done for wrestling. You know, it's hard to answer that question of, will I learn anything? Because, again, there could be someone watching that's only been watching WWE for a few months. Yes, you're going to learn loads. But if you're someone like me that's been watching for 30-odd years, well, I don't think that you will learn anything in regards to, oh, I never knew that happened, right? But it's the context around it all. Right, it's hearing Vince's side of things. It's hearing some stories which you definitely wouldn't have heard before, and just little bits and bobs, really. But all those little bits and bobs from across a 6-hour docuseries really do add up into making this, I think, like I would say, unmissable. I think this is really essential viewing if you are a WWE fan, right? So those are my thoughts. I think I might have one more here. There is a clip here. I can't play them due to copyright, but Vince finishes the whole thing talking about his legacy. They do have to cobble together footage from 2021, some other clips of Vince, because Vince actually doesn't do any more interviews, I think, after 2022. So they have to kind of use footage that they've got from 2021 or clips from other places. But it's a really interesting end to the whole thing. So, but yeah, here, look, I've said my score is 8.5. Episode list in order, if you just wanted to watch what I think are the best episodes. I think 5 is the best, focusing on the family. Then I think 6, the final one. So you could do 5, 6, and I think you've watched the best 2. I think 2, because of the amount of scandals that's in there, is next. Then you've got 4, which I think is the Owen passing, the tragedy. 1 is a nice intro. I think 1 kind of gets the ball rolling pretty well, but you won't really learn much from it. And then I think 3 is the worst because of it being the Screwjob, and just sort of know everything about the Screwjob, so I didn't really take much from that. So for me, that's the list of episodes in order. That's my score. Loads of talking points and quotes, and 22 pages of notes. So with that being said, I don't know how I'm going to do this. We're just going to have to give it a good go, right? And we'll see where we end up, shall we? So let's start. So I've got a picture for each of the episodes. I'll just change over the picture when we get to the next episode. So there was 100 hours of interviews, loads of good clips, really interesting stuff. I've obviously not been able to jot everything down, but and there's a bit where he kind of barges into Kevin Owens backstage, and I mean, I just wrote that down because I was like, oh, that would be a fun little clip. But this thing is just full of that kind of stuff where you're like, oh, like, you know, he's working out in a gym and you're like, oh, that's good. Or you see some old action figures, like some old promo, you go, oh, that's good. I mean, there's tons of stuff that you could make clips out of and share on X. I mean, I don't know if you'd get done for copyright or whatnot, but just loads of clips and footage, some brilliant stuff. So This was multiple people that basically said people don't know who Vince is because he shows you what he wants you to see, right? And then obviously we go into him having to step aside and the NDAs, and it's kind of a little, this is what's coming up, right? It's kind of an intro. So Vince comes out with an interesting line here. He said, "I wish I could tell you the real stories, but I don't want people to know, to really know me." So he kind of laughs as he says that. I wish I could tell you the real stories, but I don't want people to know the real me. So we go into an explanation of what pro wrestling is. Bret Hart and Hulk Hogan and Stone Cold and Undertaker, and like there's so many people, Shawn Michaels, there's so many people that are sat down giving, like, you know, talking. Bret Hart refers to himself as a true artist, right? And Vince said that pro wrestling is all about emotion and grandeur. Vince grew up in a trailer and he was abused as he grew up, I believe, by his stepfather. He speaks about his dad, his real dad, Vince McMahon Sr., and speaks about how his dad had like a glow to him. He said he never talked about why his dad wasn't there in his early life. They never had that conversation. He said that what he did talk to his dad about was business because that's what they had in common. And he got to like run the north part of the promotion, the territory. Bangor is the area that I don't know if he was booking it or just overseeing it, but apparently one day they needed an announcer in 1976. And, you know, Vince stepped up. And so it kind of shows that Vince, in that kind of mid to late 70s periods, is doing lots of different jobs for his dad, his real dad, in WWF. And he talks about how eventually he got to the point where his dad wanted to sell the business. He had no intention of selling to Vince, but Vince wanted it. And so they came up with an agreement, and that is that he would pay in installments. And Vince said he doesn't like pro wrestling. He wants to be beyond pro wrestling. He wants to do something beyond it, right? He said that he took over in the early 1980s. He said that Gorilla Monsoon, he thinks, saw him as a bit of a threat, and he was right to, because Gorilla was very powerful back then because he actually had shares in the company. And so I think Gorilla was maybe under the impression that maybe the company would be his one day. Gorilla agreed to sell his shares to Vince, so there was nothing bad between them. But when Vince like came into the business, Gorilla was a bit like, is this guy coming to take the business away? And that's exactly what happened. So he said he didn't know if his dad wanted him to succeed with those payments or not, because the agreement was if he didn't pay his dad, then the company would go back to his dad and his dad would get to keep the money as well. So he said that he knew that he would be upsetting his dad by invading the other territories. You just didn't do that. So he, like, you know, he kind of kept that to himself, that was his plan, like going like national. And they talk about all the wrestlers that he pinched from the other territories. It shows you like Roddy Piper, I think, in Mid-Atlantic, and then him in WWF. They show you Hogan in the AWA, and then they show him in the WWF. Like, they just go through a little list of some of the talent that he pinched. A quote here, he said, "If you can't compete with me, tough." That was a Vince quote. He talks about how Dusty Rhodes was a possibility because he said that Bob Backlund was the champ when he bought the company, and that was his dad's vision. That's who his dad wanted. It's not who Vince wanted. So, yeah, he was looking at the idea of going with Dusty, but Dusty couldn't commit to that. I don't know if Dusty believed in the project, but Dusty was a no-go. So Sterling Golden is what Hulk Hogan was first called. Not when he came back, but like when he worked for Vince's dad. And so Hulk Hogan is the person that ends up coming in. And obviously we get Hulkamania. Vince talks about how you can't take the values of today and apply them back then, because at this point we're talking about Hogan coming in and beating the Iron Sheik to become the champion, right? Vince is kind of talking about the Iron Sheik and how he was hated, and we obviously had issues with Iran at that time, and you just couldn't really get away with doing that now. But this is where Vince is like, you can't take the values of today and like apply them to the past, because it was a different time, there were different values, there was different tolerances, and I thought that was interesting, because obviously if anyone's going to have a problem with the Iron Sheik, I mean, this is going to be quite a wild ride, isn't it? Because there's loads of scandals in this thing. So if you're going to get upset at the Iron Sheik, you're probably not going to make it through the 6-hour docuseries, right? So Hogan said that he called the match in the ring when he faced the Iron Sheik, which I thought was interesting. Obviously, that match is a very important match, 1984. It's where Hogan beats the Sheik and becomes champion. And that is, you know, we're off to the races, the start of Hulkamania, but certainly the build towards 1985 and WrestleMania. So apparently just before Vince's dad died, he said that he loved Vince. He said Vince Sr. told Vince he loved him just the day before he died, and apparently that was the only time he ever said it. And also Vince Sr. apparently said, F them all, talking about all the different territories. I'm proud of you. So apparently this happening quite close to when Vince Sr. passes away. Vince partners up with the USA Network in the mid-80s. That's obviously a big development. Tuesday Night Titans, the kind of sit-down talk show that Vince was on with Lord Alfred Hayes. Vince says that was so much fun to do. And that is just not really a wrestling show. It's like a talk show. And it kind of shows like how Vince was taking things in a different direction. I also didn't know this. Vince worked on the David Letterman show as a host for a show, just for one show. It's like a birthday anniversary type show. And they've got footage of him, just like working on the show. So I just thought that was really interesting. There was a quote here as well from Vince. He said, women's wrestling was day class A, which I've never heard day class A. So that was a word I'd not encountered, but apparently it means it's lower than, it's reduced in value. So he said that women's wrestling was day class A in a day class A business. So he was saying that like women's wrestling was looked down on, if you will, lower than, in a looked down on, lower than business. So really, women's wrestling in the 80s was the lowest of the low, right? And the reason we're talking about this is because we are building to WrestleMania 1, and we know how important rock and wrestling was. So Cyndi Lauper, MTV, Wendy Richter, Mr. T, WrestleMania 1, closed circuit. We touch on all of that. John Stossel is a reporter. He actually goes along to, I think, the build towards WrestleMania 1. And they think he's there to kind of cover like the business and how exciting everything is. He's actually there to expose the business and find out if it's fake. And apparently Vince said, I wish someone would take care of this guy, when he found out that this John Stossel was not on their side. And David Schultz, who was one of the wrestlers, he ended up just absolutely like battering this guy backstage, which is obviously assault and is obviously a big problem. Tony Atlas says, though, everyone celebrated. Everyone celebrated because this was a guy that was trying to expose the business. This was a guy, an outsider, that was being disrespectful. So, you know, they didn't really think anything of it. Everyone celebrated, but then a lawsuit came in. And I think this is the first time that we're starting to see like a lawsuit and a scandal kind of coming into WWF at the time. There was another one as well, someone called Belzer, who Hogan went onto his show and choked him out, and he actually does pass out, hits his head, he's got blood on the back of his head. That was another lawsuit that came in. And all of this happening as we're trying to build to WrestleMania 1. So at WrestleMania 1, Stephanie said, I heard that we would go belly up if this failed, and I didn't understand what that meant. It was a roll of the dice. It was a big one, said Vince. I don't know if this was good for the industry, right? WrestleMania 1 being a success, because it was a big success, but it was good for me and my business. Greater success. With greater success comes greater scrutiny. And Vince said there is such thing as bad publicity. Basically it's scandals now that we're moving on to. So both of the lawsuits that we spoke about, they both get settled. But that is it for basically the first episode. That for me was all the major talking points. Let's go over straight away to episode 2, and this is where we really get into some scandals. This is called Heat, episode 2. So Saturday night's main event goes onto network TV. I think they said whenever Saturday Night Live had a week off. Wrestlers are talking about how hard it was, the grind, like the amount of dates you have to work, and how it's better today. Dave Meltzer said, "You wrestled hurt." I mean, it was just brutal. Jesse the Body wanted to start a union at this time. Hulk Hogan admits that he told Vince about this. And Vince even talks about it. He says, quite frankly, no one in the locker room would have got behind Jesse anyway. So Vince kind of dismisses it like, yeah, look, he might think he was going to start a union, but no one would have followed him. No one would have got behind his plans. And he kind of just dismisses it. But I thought it was interesting to hear Vince talk about that and Hogan talk about it as well. Kind of admit that he did go to Vince. At WrestleMania 2, Hogan said he heard Vince say, "We'll never do that again," because they tried to go a bit bigger this time by doing 3 different venues. So there was like 5 matches from that venue, 5 matches from this venue, 5 matches from this venue. And it was just a nightmare because that's like 3 different crews, 3 different setups, 3 different commentator teams, and like the trucks, and I mean the cost, and just a nightmare. Over complicated, and Hogan said just it didn't work, and he heard Vince say we'll never do that again. WrestleMania 3 though, this is where Vince had to convince Andre to return, and that's where we got our great Andre story from earlier. Vince said we sold 93,000 seats. And there was a bit of concern from Hogan because they just didn't know what Andre was going to do. And Vince said, look, he'll do the right thing. And in the ring, of course, Andre does do the right thing and he puts Hogan over. Vince said it was probably the greatest attraction we ever had. Dave Meltzer says that Andre had lost before. WWE said he hadn't. He had been slammed before. I think he says he'd been slammed about 25 times before WrestleMania 3. And it was not 93,000 people. So Dave Meltzer kind of comes in and just kind of pops the bubble a little bit, right? Just a little bit. Because Vince is like, this is probably the best attraction we'd ever done. It was probably the biggest thing we'd ever done. And then you've got Dave Meltzer going, well, he had been beaten before. He had been slammed before. And it wasn't 93,000 seats that have been... Hulkamania at this point is running wild, right? Stephanie said she felt a little bit of resentment because her dad was just not getting any of the credit. I mean, she was young at the time. She didn't realize, right? Her dad was absolutely over the moon, obviously, because business was in a great place. But she was frustrated that her dad wasn't getting much credit. It was all Hogan that was getting the credit. They showed some of the Hulk Hogan products that were available. Vince said at this point he was worried about losing Hogan to Hollywood. And so they wrote No Holds Barred. I think they said it took them a couple of days to write the script. And Vince said, I thought it was going to be this massive film that everyone wanted to see. It didn't quite go that way. And he says that it didn't stop Hogan going to Hollywood, but it did delay it. Bruce names WrestleMania 6 as the start of Hulkamania declining. We just skip over Macho Man. Like, we skip over WrestleMania 4 and WrestleMania 5, which is... crazy, really. I was really surprised that we just went from WrestleMania 3 to WrestleMania 6, but I think we were really focused on Hulkamania. And so basically, WrestleMania 6, that's when Bruce Pritchard said he senses Hulkamania declining, and we see Ultimate Warrior winning the title. Hogan said, I did what Andre did for me. And he's talking about putting Warrior over. Just like how Andre put Hogan over at WrestleMania 3, he puts over the Ultimate Warrior. And basically, Ultimate Warrior was not as popular with the fans and not popular backstage. So they kind of knew that they were going to need to get Hogan back. And then we move on to Sergeant Slaughter, and there's a lot of talk about obviously what's going on at the time and the wars that are happening and everything. USA versus Iraq. It was working, but then Iraq invaded Kuwait. And obviously then, boom, there's like this whole war, real war that's happening. So having an Iraqi sympathizer, Sergeant Slaughter, like the timing could not have been worse. So Sergeant Slaughter was getting death threats and everything now. And Bob Costas, he says that wrestling took a nasty turn around this time. So it had been all fun and cartoony and whatever, but now we're dealing with like Iraqi sympathizers. And we're doing a bit of a story where it's Sergeant Slaughter, who used to be all for America, but now he's turned his back on America. We're doing this story, but at the same time that like USA are at war, and it's all just like really uncomfortable. So yeah, like that was an interesting part. Obviously, we know that Hogan beat Slaughter at WrestleMania 7, and but they're kind of painting the picture that people are still tired of Hogan, and things had took a bit of a turn. Dr. Zahorian is on trial for providing steroids to wrestlers. Now, this is the first time that we actually touch on the steroid trial, and we do stick on this for quite a while, to be honest. So Hogan talks about steroids, saying it was the norm, right? Steroids were legal, but then they became illegal, right, by the federal government. And Dr. Zahorian actually got sent to jail. I think it was for about 3 years, because it was legal to prescribe steroids, but it was not legal to just be like, you know, selling them. And this Dr. Zahorian was found to be basically selling them to the wrestlers. Like, if you want steroids, I'll just, you know, write you a prescription. I'll sell you some, no problem. Well, that was illegal. And so he ended up getting done for that. Vince actually starts the World Bodybuilding Federation around this time. And Vince said it was really bad timing. Really bad timing. There was a whole war on drugs at this time, which is why steroids were being really clamped down on. And he said there was lots of heat. I was getting it from all sides. So, you know, like, they're really looking at WWE now, the federal government, because they know that the wrestlers are on steroids and there is this war on drugs, and WWE is like popular. So he's like, I'm just getting it everywhere. And now I've just started a bodybuilding federation and they're all on steroids as well. So some amazing footage of Vince talking about this. And yeah, we've got Arsenio Hall, right? This is where Vince actually tells Hogan to go onto this talk show and just come clean. Just tell them it's going to be better if you come clean. Tell them that you have done steroids. Let's try and nip it in the bud. Hogan doesn't do that. He goes onto this talk show and actually says, no, I've never done them. I've never done steroids. Hogan said that was one of the worst decisions, not listening to Vince. He should have listened to Vince, because what was like a bad situation just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, because there is someone called Phil Mushnick, right, who's all over this docuseries. He is digging for anything he can find on WWE or Vince, and they actually interview Phil Mushnick, and they're like, why are you doing that, or why did you do that? And Phil Mushnick's like, because Vince is a dirtbag. Like, Phil Mushnick has got no doubt that Vince is a bad person, and that there's lots of bad things going on in WWF, as it was at the time. And so he was determined to dig into it and see what he could find. So Phil Mushnick said, my inbox basically said you don't know the half of it. So he was getting so many people getting in touch with him that like his inbox was overflowing, and he was very much getting the message, there's more here than you know, than you realize, right? And Tony Atlas at this point talks about how all the wrestlers abused the hell out of women. He said we all did it. And then that moves us onto the Jimmy Snuka scandal. Jimmy Snuka, the Superfly, his girlfriend died. It was quite suspicious circumstances, but there was no charges. And the Dave Meltzer said, I think Vince had a hand in making it go away, the charges, right? So the Jimmy Superfly Snuka scandal is one that left people very uncomfortable. Then we've got the Ring Boy scandal. So this is where like ring boys were used, like young men were used to like put the ring up, take the ring down. But there was sexual abuse allegations. Mel Phillips, Garvin and Pat Patterson were all named. What's really interesting is they actually show footage of someone called Tom Cole, who is one of the alleged victims, and you actually see him naming them, which I've never seen that footage. I've heard that they were all suspected or all alleged to have been involved. I've never seen the footage of one of the apparent victims actually naming them. And I thought that was quite powerful footage. Phil Mushnick's like, it was a paedophile ring. That's what it was. It was a paedophile ring, and those 3 guys were in on it. Vince settled with Tom Cole, so we find that out. And Vince said Pat was innocent, right? One of the 3 was definitely innocent. Vince was adamant that Pat was not involved. Vince called it a gay witch hunt because Pat Patterson was gay. And so he felt that Pat Patterson had been targeted for that reason. But this is really interesting from Tony Atlas. He says, I didn't like Pat because he grabbed my pecker in the locker room. So, and they're like, well, couldn't you go to Vince? And Tony Atlas just bursts out laughing at the idea of going to Vince. He says, what's that going to achieve? He needed Pat more than he needed me. So I would just be out of a job. So no, I don't think you understand how the business works or worked. So some of this stuff is like mind-blowing. They said, like, do you think Vince protected Pat? And he was like, no, I think Vince protected the business. Donahue. So on Donahue, Vince goes on to address like these scandals because, I mean, we've touched on the Jimmy Snuka scandal. We've touched on the Ring Boy scandal. You've obviously got the steroids stuff because of Dr. Zahorian. Like, there's so much going on at this time that Vince goes on the Donahue show to try and address some of this, and it really goes wrong. They're all jumping in on him. Like, it's not a pleasant experience. Apparently, Meltzer's on that show with Vince, and Vince turns to Meltzer at one point and says, this is the longest hour of my life. So that was a real struggle for Vince. But the scandals just keep on coming. And part of this I just couldn't believe, right? So Rita Marie, who is the female referee, that's the first female referee in WWE history, she alleged that there was a rape, but Vince is very clear that that never happened, right? So she claimed that she was forced into oral sex with Mr. McMahon. She says, my wrists were black and blue. I was told that I could have a $500,000 contract if I had to satisfy him in order to get that, or I would be blackballed. So she'd be out, basically. She'd be done. She'd be out of the company. So she was being pressured into doing these things. Vince says, right, so he doesn't deny that something happened because he uses the word consensual. It was consensual. So I didn't even know that he had had relations with her, but he says it was consensual. And this is the bit that I really didn't like. He said, and also, had it have been rape, right, the statute of limitations had run out anyway. So he's sort of saying, like, look, it was consensual, but even if it was rape, there's nothing she could have done because she's only got a certain period of time for it to like go to court and for it to be like looked into, and we're past that point. It's like, that's such a weird thing to add in after. That's such a weird thing to mention. That's such a weird thing. Like, you just focus on the consensual, wouldn't you? Why would you even talk about that other bit? I don't know. That bit like left me a bit. I didn't like that. Phil Mushnick said no one wanted to look deeper into this. No one was interested in really investigating this or digging into this. And actually, there was Vince sued Rita and the show that she had been on, right? So Vince took some legal action. But I think his action ended up getting dropped. So 1993 saw Vince indicted for illegal supply of steroids. So this has not gone away, these scandals, and now Vince is very much involved. Indicted for illegal supply of steroids. Phil Mushnick puts his hand up basically and says, yeah, it was me. I was an FBI informant. I'm the one that kind of told them you want to look into this and got the ball rolling. So the federal government can be the biggest bullies, said Vince. They have unlimited resources. I said, go F yourself when they asked about like a deal. So Vince was not prepared to take a deal. He was like, no, I'm going to fight this. So it went to court, and this was massive. The steroid trial is one of the biggest incidents, one of the biggest kind of moments in the history of WWE. They show Vince wearing a neck brace when he goes to court. And obviously the story has always been, or the theory has always been, that he did it to kind of get sympathy. And Vince denies that. He denies that he did it for sympathy. There's apparently a sign that Hogan starts seeing, like, different signs. You can tell the crowd has turned on him. Because, of course, he went on and said he hadn't done steroids, but everyone can tell that he had. So there's a sign, "Hey, Hogan, did you take your shot today?" Hogan says it wasn't the easiest of times. You're talking about 92, 93, that kind of time periods. And he said, "I knew that I needed to go." So we're talking about WCW. They're around at the moment. Eric Bischoff said WCW just didn't have a vision. They didn't have a strategy. They were basically just a poor version of WWF. That was Eric Bischoff's own words, right? But he said, "I could offer Hulk Hogan 30 dates a year rather than 300 and competitive pay. Probably better pay, actually, than what he was getting in WWF. So that just worked for him better." Like, Hogan had left to go and do films, do TV. I think it was Thunder in Paradise. And so he basically said, like, why don't you come and work for WCW? I can get you a load of money and you're only going to have to do so many dates a year. And it was a much better deal than Hogan ever would have got with WWF. But Vince said, like, it broke my heart because Hogan had told Vince when he left he would not go and work for any competitor. And now here he is going to WCW. And all of this whilst Vince is in that steroid trial. So Vince is in this steroid trial. He's got all these other scandals. There's all this pressure on Vince. And now Hogan has gone to his main rival. And he said, even to this day, that was taboo in my book, says Shane. So Shane is not pleased about that decision that Hogan took there. The government made Hogan testify against Vince. They actually said to Hogan that he would face 17 years if he didn't do it. Because apparently they had something on him. That's what Meltzer said. Meltzer said Hogan didn't want to testify on Vince. They forced him. They had something on him. The government had something on Hogan. So Hogan had to agree to do it. Vince said, "Look, I truly believe in the law of the jungle. If something's weak, then you pile on it. You kill it. It's the law of the jungle. I get it." He's talking about himself. He's talking about how he was weak and how the government and everyone was piling on him. And that's kind of how it felt for him at that time. So Vince withdrew his lawsuits, as we said. But what was interesting is Rita, the female ref, she actually got paid multi-million-dollar settlement in 2023. So she actually got money from Vince. So back in the day, he sued her for the things that she had said. But I think because of the sheer weight of all the allegations that Vince was facing in recent years, she has received a payment as well, probably to keep her quiet, I would imagine. Probably to prevent her case being heard or someone taking an interest in it. So she actually received money recently, 2023. And that was the end of episode 2. I can already tell we're going to go well over. I didn't want to go over an hour, but I mean, honestly, there's just so much to talk about. Let's just get through it. Let's just get through it. I don't want to cut out any detail. Plus, also, I'm thinking if I've put timestamps in, which I'm definitely going to do, then people can just jump to the bits they want to jump to anyway. I'd imagine most people probably left for the overview bit. But I don't know. I hope people are enjoying the detail. As I said, 22 pages of notes I've got. So episode 3 is titled Screwjob, right? It starts with the Wendy Richter Screwjob. So Wendy had become a problem, said Vince. That was a painful night. My dreams were shattered, said Wendy. And this was because Wendy, I think, was getting disillusioned, maybe with the pay and how she was being treated, certainly compared to like how the guys were being treated and their pay and everything. And as a result, she was like not willing to kind of drop the belt and give someone else a run with the belt. And so Vince had the fabulous Moolah wear a mask, roll at Wendy, and he told the ref to count the 3. You actually see the footage where Wendy gets her shoulder up, but the ref just counts it. And Vince said, "I don't fight fair. It was nothing personal. There's nothing I just wouldn't do for business." I can sort of see Vince's side, though, because he can't run the risk of someone like hijacking his belt. If he wants that belt to go on to another wrestler, well, that's his right, isn't it? So I can sort of see his side on that. But I do also feel sorry for Wendy, because I do think that the women's division could have been invested in at that time, or should have been invested in at that time. So I certainly see where she's coming from. But I do understand Vince's side there as well. So I don't know what that's known as. I don't know if that's known as the original Screwjob. I mean, we're talking 80s here. I'm not sure what that one's known as. So, but I've known of it for years and years and years. Wendy Richter, and I think it was the Spider Lady, but it was actually Fabulous Moolah under a mask. Right, so Hogan testifies. That's where we got to at the end of episode 2. So Hogan testifies, but Hogan doesn't drop Vince in it. He doesn't do what the government think he's going to do. Right, so the government are surprised. So basically they're like, did Vince give you steroids? And Hogan's like, nope. Did Vince give any of the other wrestlers steroids? Nope. And like the government are like really surprised. Tony Atlas said he let us do it, but he didn't give them to us. So I genuinely believe this. I genuinely don't think Vince did supply steroids to the wrestlers. Dave Meltzer just has to come in, though, and point out that Vince is not a good guy, because Vince is found innocent in this steroid trial. And like Dave Meltzer says, you know, there's rumors that witnesses were contacted, and there's lots of like gray area stuff which is alleged when it comes to this case. So, you know, let's not make out that Vince was a sweet, innocent guy. But listen, he's found innocent in this case. Bruce said, look, things were tight and they were scary because business was struggling, right? Vince might have been found innocent, but that doesn't change the fact they don't have Hogan. The WWF has been battered with bad PR. And so business is just down. And so this is where now we're in the mid-90s. We're looking at Lex Luger. Vince says Lex was okay, but he was nowhere near Hogan, which I just thought was an interesting line. We have a look at Brett. We have a look at Shawn. We have a look at Undertaker. Who would step up and fill that Hulk Hogan spot, right? Vince says, because we look at Brett, the Hart family, a very interesting family, says Vince. WCW were offering big money at this point. Randy Savage goes over there, and Ted Turner moves WCW to Monday nights. So we're getting the Monday Night Wars. Lex Luger goes to WCW, and Bruce says that was embarrassing when that happened. They didn't even know that his contract had expired. Eric said he sat down, Eric Bischoff. He looked at WWF and he was like, right, they're taped. We'll go live. They're cartoony. We'll go like more real. And so he tried to do the opposite of everything that WWF were doing at that time. And he was giving away results as well. Because he was live, he could give away the results of WWF. So, like at the start of some of the WCW shows, they would actually give the results away. And Vince said that hurt us, and it aggravated us for sure. We see Medusa, Alundra Blaze, dropping the WWF Women's title in the bin on WCW, a very famous incident. And then we see Vince doing the Billionaire Ted skits. This is where he was making fun of Ted Turner. He was making fun of Hulk Hogan. Basically anyone that had left to go to WCW, Vince was like making fun out of them. But USA Network asked Vince to stop doing that, because I think they had like the Turner Network get in touch saying this isn't on, right? So Vince kind of had to stop doing those. But to be honest, they were cringe anyway. Like, they weren't funny, they were cringe. It was really just, I think, because Vince was hurt and he was like doing it for that reason. It wasn't good, like, or entertaining. So yeah, USA asked him to stop. Then we move on to the curtain call, which is really interesting. So Triple H talks about the curtain call. Vince said that Shawn had spoke to him about, like, you know, doing a little something because Kevin Nash and Scott Hall were leaving. They were going to WCW. So Vince said to Shawn, look, if it's important to you, it's important to me. And so he allowed the curtain call. Vince allowed them. And the curtain call is where you had heels and faces kind of embracing and celebrating together after a house show. There was a house show, and because two of them were leaving, the clique, this group, they all got together and celebrated in the ring. The problem was some of them were faces, some of them were heels, and the crowd watching didn't know what was going on. I mean, there was a big reaction because there was something happening. Like, this doesn't happen. What we're seeing right now, this is something different. And so there was a big reaction, and that's the point that Triple H made, actually. Triple H basically said the biggest reaction that night is what we did at the end. The world was changing. And it is true, because obviously that kind of protecting the business, we can't have heels and faces celebrating together in the ring after the show. The world was changing, you know. We didn't have to be quite as protective about the business anymore, because there was dirt sheets and there was chat rooms, and wrestling fans were communicating a lot more and finding out more information, more behind the scenes information. So, yeah, we've got Undertaker saying, I've got thoughts on all of that. I didn't like it. So Undertaker was still very old school. And, you know, this is where we talk about kayfabe. This is where we talk about Undertaker protecting his character. Vince said, I let it happen. I knew I couldn't let it happen again. So basically, like, Vince kind of got it wrong, really. He allowed Shawn to do something which he probably shouldn't have allowed Shawn to do. And someone was going to have to pay the price. And obviously, Vince wasn't just going to, you know, blame himself. He wasn't going to blame Shawn, because Shawn, I think, was the champion at the time. He couldn't blame Kevin Nash or Scott Hall because they were leaving. And so it was Triple H. Triple H was the one that got the blame. And he was going to win King of the Ring. And of course, he doesn't. And so he gets kind of punished that way. So, yeah, Vince said, you're going to have to eat shit and like it, which is quite the line, isn't it? There is bad language in this, by the way. So, outsiders then going into WCW, and a blurring of the lines, right? This bit is bonkers. This bit is bonkers, right? So, basically, with all these people going to WCW, Vince said, Ted's philosophy was to hurt competitors. Mine was different. Mine was that I just wanted to compete against other people. And so they say to Vince, well, don't you look at what Ted was doing as competing? And Vince goes, well, yeah, sure I did. And they're like, well, it's the same then, isn't it? What he was doing was the exact same as what you did, like, just before, like, WrestleMania 1, when you went and got all those people from the different territories. Like, it's the same thing. And Vince comes out with this, like, really weird line. First of all, he doesn't say the word correct. He goes, wrecked. He goes, wrecked, which is so strange. That's one of those little clips I could see doing the rounds on social media, right? So he says, some might think that it can be hypocritical for me to say, okay, I don't hurt someone else. I just do what's best for me. Yet when someone comes after me, they don't have the right. What I say a lot of times is different to what I think. The public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, you have to throw things out there, not really the way you feel, but it controls your thought process by doing that. So he's basically saying that sometimes he says different to what he's thinking, and it helps control his thoughts by doing that. It's such a crazy line, that. This whole thing I wrote down because I just thought it was so interesting. So interesting. He tried to find a way of saying what WCW were doing to him was different to what he did in the 80s. It isn't. It's exactly the same. And he kind of, I think, has to sort of admit that it's the same. And then that's when he comes out with that line. What I say a lot of times is totally different to what I think. The public doesn't understand that. Sometimes, as a businessman, you have to throw things out there, not really the way you feel, but it controls the thought process by doing that. What a quote. Bash at the Beach is where we move on to, and that's what Bruce says is the moment where WCW, now they've got all this talent, they now surge ahead of WWF. Vince had no plans to turn Hogan heel. He admits to that. But he does also say that they did it well in WCW, that heel turn. Who is the third man? In those days, it was a personal relationship as well as a business one. So his relationship with Hogan, it was personal as well as business, which is why when Hogan ended up going to WCW, it hurt him so much. So this obviously now is the formation of NWO. We've got the whole 83 weeks that WCW are winning the Monday Night Wars. And now we move on to a conversation of like the war, if you will, right? And how Vince always saw it as WWE and himself against Ted Turner, right? The guy that kind of owned the network. He never saw it as him versus Eric Bischoff. And Eric Bischoff is like, yeah, of course he didn't, because like he shouldn't struggle against me. He wants people to look at him as like being the vulnerable underdog. Like, here's this billionaire that owns networks. How's Vince meant to compete with that? Right? That's the kind of image that Vince wants people to focus on. He doesn't want people to focus on the fact that he's struggling to compete against me, like Eric Bischoff, which I thought was a really interesting kind of way of looking at that. So Vince says, I didn't realize that Eric had actually auditioned for us years earlier as an announcer. And the person doing the interview says, do you regret not hiring him? And Vince said, no, I don't regret anything in my life. Brett, at this point now, is going to WCW. Vince obviously knew about this one. He even kind of pushed Brett because he just couldn't afford the contract. And so he said, like, see if you can get yourself a good deal in WCW. So that's exactly what Brett did. Brett said that Shawn Michaels, though, was a dick at the time, and Brett was champion, and he just did not want to drop the belt to Shawn. I think everyone knows the Montreal Screwjob at this point. I mean, it's got to be the most covered topic in the history of WWE. Like, the Montreal Screwjob is it's always spoken about. So I don't think we need to spend too long on this, but I did like Shawn saying, look, back then I was such a prick. My thoughts, said Vince, is, well, this is going to be good for TV. So I got emotional. I put him through a lot. That's Shawn talking about Vince. So he's basically saying, look, whatever he was going to ask me to do, I would do it because I put him through a lot back then. So the plan was they were going to do a Schmaltz finish, which is where there's no winner, right? And then, of course, we see what happens. So the sharpshooter's applied. The sharpshooter was applied wrong by Shawn Michaels. And Vince, at this point, is, ring the bell. Bell gets rung. Brett spits in Vince's eye. And Vince said, in that moment, I thought it was gross. But I also thought, how did he do that? So he spits at him. It goes right in his eye. And he was like, that is gross. But how did he manage that? Which I just thought was so interesting. That is something about the screw job I'd never heard before. Brett gets choked up when he talks about Owen, like coming up to him and consoling him about the fact that he'd just been screwed over in Montreal. Brett said, I was ready to get backstage and kill Vince, right? Vince said to Shawn and Triple H, just lie about it, say you didn't know anything. Vince said, I felt like I owed Brett something, right? After the fact that I just screwed him, I felt I owed him something. So he goes to the locker room with his hands down, and Brett hit me so hard on the temple. It's the best thing I ever did. He deserved that, says Brett. Vince has a black eye. There it is. And a pretty good concussion. To this day, I don't regret any of it, says Vince. So Vince doesn't regret any of it. I don't think Brett regrets punching Vince. Vince doesn't regret the Montreal Screwjob. And this obviously leads to the birth of the Mr. McMahon character. And that takes us into episode number 4. So that was episode 3. So let's change over to episode 4. And this is called Attitude, right? So we start with something really interesting here, and that is Vince talking about his favourite wrestler from back in the day, and that was Dr. Jerry Graham. We see footage, and Vince talks about how he was a heel, he dyed his hair blonde, he used to do a strut. Vince copied all of that, right? And Vince tells a story where he rode with Dr. Jerry Graham and they were just running through lights. And he was like, this is the life I want to live. This is what I want to do. And they kind of show like Dr. Jerry Graham and then they cut it to like Mr. McMahon to show that in many ways Vince did go on to live that life. So it was just a good little intro. A good intro to episode 4, I thought. There's lots of... there's a disclaimer that just says all the interviews you're going to see are before Vince resigned from the company, right? So, right, fans knew about the double cross, the Montreal Screwjob, right? Trish actually says, as a Canadian, I effing hated it, right? Brett screwed Brett. At this point, Vince has got heat, and he knew that he needed to turn that, or he could turn that into money, into like the business, yeah? Vince said, I always wanted to be a performer. The Attitude Era is born when Shawn Michaels comes out one day in just shorts, kind of dancing his way down the ring, and he's stuffed his shorts to kind of make his package look bigger. And Bruce says that's the moment that the Attitude Era is born, because Shawn is actually fined $10,000 for doing that. Shawn says, I did manage to get out of that fine. But basically, he also said to Vince, look, go back, watch it. You tell me that's not funny. That's the kind of thing we should be doing. And basically Vince, I don't know if he did go back and watch it, but in one of the meetings, he basically said, look, Shawn's got attitude. We all need to get more attitude. And apparently it's this moment here. You know, obviously the Montreal Screwjob is a big factor. But then, you know, it's lots of little things. It's lots of little bits. But that's the moment that Bruce says the Attitude Era is born. We have a look at DX arriving. We look at Stone Cold. We have a look at ECW. Vince said that he appreciated that promotion and he appreciated the promoter behind it, which of course was Paul Heyman. Austin 316 was based on John 316, which was a sign that used to be held up at the football, different football games. And Vince said as soon as he heard Austin 316, he thought that might not play too well in the Bible Belt, but it was brilliant. It changed who he was as a character. Then we look at Mike Tyson getting involved, and there's a great line here where Steph said, well, he hadn't been arrested for rape at this point when we brought him in. And someone says something, and she goes, he had. So she didn't even realize that when they'd brought Mike Tyson in, he'd already been done for rape. She didn't realize. She didn't know that. So it's a 2013 interview. That Steph kind of goes, what he had been done for rape by that point. So that was an interesting little clip. Vince, a journalist says, Vince, are you becoming a bad guy as we're heading into the Attitude Era? Vince says, I've always been a good guy, which I just thought was a fun little exchange. Good guy and bad guy. Vince made it bad guy and worse, says Tony Atlas. So basically, it used to be good guy versus bad guy. In the Attitude Era, it was bad guy versus worse guy. There was no good guys. But then they talk about how in culture, that's just what you saw. Like, there weren't good guys on TV. Like, you turn on Jerry Springer, you got a stage full of bad guys, you know? You turn on, like, South Park, you've got loads of, like, bad characters. Like, there's not people really to root for. That was kind of the culture at the time. And so, like, we're really digging into the Attitude Era at this point. So, Mr. McMahon becomes a character. And he talks about how he grew up dirt poor. He said, I didn't grow up liking rich people. I was good at fighting and stuff like that. And I'd get into fights and I would never fight fair, but I would always win. It was easy for me to be that character because I know what I hated. Rich people, they try to intimidate you. And he says, I loved getting heat. I loved manipulating the audience. I loved feeling it. I wasn't afraid of it. I could embrace it. And it was such a good feeling. That's Vince talking about being a heel. It's all about emotion and getting like the emotion out of it. And he says there's no similarities between Mr. McMahon and Vince, right? But Bruce, Hulk Hogan, Shawn Michaels, and Stone Cold all said there is no difference. There's no difference between them. Vince said there's no similarities. But all of those were like, no, they're exactly the same person. Vince and Mr. McMahon, exactly the same. I'm passionate. Maybe I can get a bit out of bounds sometimes, says Vince, when they say to him that all these people have said you're basically the same as the character. He kind of laughs it off. He said, it used to bug the hell out of me, but I'm not that guy. Perception is reality. So he's talking about how he used to get really frustrated when people said that he was the character. But he's like, I've given up on that now. Vince took our formula and he did it better, said Eric Bischoff. Vince got lucky. Stone Cold was a big success. And then along comes The Rock, says Dave Meltzer. Then we have a look at The Rock. We have a look at The Rock's family history, the Anoa'i family. We look at Rocky Maivia coming in and being hated. Die, Rocky, die. We have a look at Nation of Domination. This was all interesting. Like Rock said how honored he was to be the first black world champion in WWE history. And Vince said that he didn't care. He doesn't see color. He didn't care. And actually, people do agree with that. There's not people saying that that's a lie. They're saying that Vince didn't care what color you are as long as you draw money. I think Tony Atlas says the only color that Vince was interested in was green. Money. Right? WWE becomes mainstream. It's pop culture. It's Attitude Era. But then we touch on the moral questions of the Attitude Era. Obviously, we're dealing with blackface. You've got the Godfather with his hose. You got Val Venus. You got Big Boss Man being hung. It was still family friendly, just not aimed at young kids, says Vince. And this bit was a bit dirty. They were like, look, he's saying, look, there was no rape. There was no guns. And as he's saying these things, the producers of the show put in clips where Vince is saying to someone, you're a rapist. And then when it's like there was no guns, they show the bit where Pillman has got a gun. So basically the things that Vince is saying, look, there was none of this. They're showing that there was, which I thought they sort of did him a little dirty there. A little dirty. So no rape, no guns, both get shown. Shawn Michaels said there are times, though, that we could have been less objective about women. We followed what was going on. Women were actually sometimes the highest rated segments, even higher than some of our great matches. So Vince is trying to defend how they treated women in the Attitude Era by saying, listen, they were getting some of the best ratings. Their segments were some of the highest, most watched segments on the show. So we weren't treating them bad. I mean, make of that whatever you want. Triple H says, it's interesting to think who's worse, the people that were making the show or the people that loved watching the show. Makes you think, he was being cheeky. He wasn't being serious. I think the point he was making was it's easy to look back at the Attitude Era now and say, oh my God, it's so trash. Like the way that they were treating women and all this kind of stuff. The point Triple H is saying is, yeah, you can say that, but what about all the millions and millions and millions of people that were watching at the time and didn't have any objections whilst it was on? Which I thought was an interesting point. Right, then, obviously, we're well past the Screwjob now. We see Owen Hart, and he agrees to stay. Obviously, he's Bret's brother, for those that don't know. Bret said they kept him around and they humiliated him, and I thought they did that to get back at me. And Vince kind of takes offense to that. He's like, really, Bret, you think we was trying to humiliate him? No, we were trying to make him a star. Like, we were doing what we could to, make him a star. Bret said he just knew the day that Owen died that something bad had happened before even being told. And Vince says, thank God we were in a blackout when it happened. The audience didn't see. So Vince talks about his continuing the show, his decision to continue the show. They show the blood that was in the ring. Obviously, this is Owen Hart tragically falling from the ceiling and falling to his death in the ring. And had it have been me, I would have wanted the show to have gone on, said Vince. And this is a bit that's one of the most uncomfortable bits because, of course, Vince would want the show to go on because it's his company and it's his show. So, of course, if he died in the ring, he would want it to continue. But it's not Owen's company. It's not Owen's show. So the circumstances are completely different. And Brett says, had that have been one of Vince's kids, you know, would the show have continued? I don't think it would. Had that have been Shane or someone, would the show have carried on? I don't think it would. And I must admit, you know, it is shocking to see the blood on the ring where Owen has fallen. And it is shocking to hear Vince kind of talking about the reasons as to why the show continued. Vince said, had the lights have been on and the audience had clearly seen Owen fall, then there's no way the show would have continued. But because it all happened like in the dark, he felt like the show could continue. So he speaks about that. And Brett, this is heartbreaking. Brett says at that time, like, I was really thinking maybe they murdered him to get to me. This is kind of where Brett's head was. But there was an investigation and they promised Brett they would tell him the findings, like one of the investigators. And he called up Brett, one of the investigators, and said, look, there's nothing here that suggests foul play. Like, this just looks like it's an unfortunate accident. And Brett said that was a big moment for him. That was a big moment for him. So basically they pay Owen's widow, WWF do, but then WWF sue the people that have made the harness for Owen. And Vince is like, it wasn't our fault. It was defective apparatus. And they basically sued them. So that is the end of episode 4. And honestly, that's a segment. I think it's about 8 minutes long, the Owen bit. And I can't really put into words that segment. Like, you need to watch that bit. I thought it was very powerful, that bit. Very thought-provoking. Had a whole range of emotions. So that was episode 4. We move on to episode 5. And this was my favourite episodes. I really got a lot from this one. So this is called Family Business, right? So, abused. So they start off with Heyman talking. He says, you know, Vince was abused and he worked hard so that he could get to a level where he was untouchable. And that's what he achieved, wasn't it? You know, he was raised in a trailer, flat broke. And he worked and worked and worked to get to a point where he was seemingly untouchable. We know that would not be true. There was a Playboy interview that Vince did where he talks about how his stepfather had physically abused him when he was young. And there's even a little bit of an insinuation that there might have been some sexual abuse from his mother. But I'm a bit confused by that because it literally just says that and that's it. We don't touch on that again. And there's even footage of his mom, I believe it's his mom, backstage at like a WWE show. So I'm not sure what that relationship was like. We don't really dig into that at all. Vince said he's not big on looking back. He says there was fighting, there was infighting. I'm sure he says there was incest. Right? You don't like it when you're getting the crap beat out of you. If you're still breathing, if you're still alive, then you win, says Vince. I know that if you're abused as a kid, then you can go on to abuse, but I've never subscribed to that. I think it's just a cop-out. Anything that's rotten, get rid of it. And we see a montage of the Mr. McMahon character at this point. So that's quite a powerful intro into episode. That's just the intro as we go into episode 5, which is largely about family. So we look at Shane and Steph. Shane said, I always wanted to be in the business. He talks about competing in during the Attitude Era. Like, you'd have to go through Shane to get to his dad. And he said, Steph said, some people loved me at school because of my dad, and some people hated me because of my dad. We see Triple H and Steph. Obviously, she comes into the show. The crowd chants slut at Steph on like WWE TV. These are things which I think if you're a wrestling fan, and certainly someone that like has seen the Attitude Era, this isn't a surprise. There's a lot in here that I feel really desensitized to because I've watched wrestling for so long. But I think if you're someone that really has not seen much wrestling, seeing a woman walk down to the ring and having an arena full of people calling her a slut, I could imagine that being really shocking to me, I mean, it's not, because I know what the Attitude Era was like. So it's really weird, because I think if you're a casual WWE fan, there might be loads in here that just blows your minds. I mean, you might not have heard of like a load of these scandals, for example. You might not have heard about them. And even moments like that, which I think are going to be, for me, they're tame. I mean, but there's going to be people out there that are going to be shocked by some of this stuff. Vince has got a big smile on his face as well. And he's like, I've got a big smile because the audience were participating. And that's what we're looking for. So he wasn't worried that his daughter was being called a slut. He was loving the fact that the crowd were engaged. And there's a lot of those kinds of moments where Vince just doesn't look like a good dad, you know, because he's putting the business first. But it is a weird business as well, isn't it? It is a weird business. This isn't like running the local shop, you know? Like, these are characters. They're portraying characters, but as we see throughout this docuseries, you know, that line can be blurred sometimes. Like, where does the character end? Where does the real person begin, and vice versa? So, yeah, she comes down. Vince talks about that. Then we talk about the McMahon-Helmsley era, about how she gets with Triple H. Apparently, Shane was really against Triple H dating Steph. Really against it. Vince suggested that Steph and Triple H's wedding could be on pay-per-view. Even as he tells, like, the story of him proposing that as an idea, he still seems quite excited about it now. But apparently Steph shot that down, right? And Vince had a match with Steph just 6 days before her real wedding. And apparently Linda said that if Steph got any marks on her from that match, like, she would divorce Vince. And she was serious about it as well. Like, she didn't want her daughter having her big day ruined. But Vince is not really worried about that, is he? Is thinking about, I'm going to do this match and I'm going to get, like, you know, ratings and all that kind of stuff. Like, he is business first. And that does come across all the time. We talk about Linda actually a bit here. We really don't talk about Linda much, but we talk about how she was running the business. Vince was running the creative, but it was Linda that was really propping the business up behind the scenes. Vince met Linda when she was 16. Vince was attracted to her because she was a middle-class girl. He was poor, but equally Linda said that he was, you know, a bit of a live wire, and she was quite attracted to that. Linda was 17 when they got married. Linda is not a very good actress on the show. She didn't want to be on the show. She didn't want to be a character on the show. But they found a way of involving her when she was in the wheelchair. Trish arrives on the scene, like, you know, as the helper. Obviously, we're talking around WrestleMania 17 at this point. Vince talks about kissing Trish in front of Linda. He says, I don't think anyone had an issue with me doing that. And then we cut to Shane, who says, yeah, I wasn't keen on that. I wasn't keen on that. He's very protective of his mom, Shane. So anything that kind of involved Linda or was, you know. But they do stress that apparently there was a moment where Trish kisses Linda on the forehead while she's, like, you know, pretending to be, like, in a coma. And that apparently was Linda's idea. That was Linda's idea. So Linda was seemingly on board with this, and she was kind of trying to come up with ideas and ways of kind of making this story work, you know? We see Trish being humiliated around this time, barking like a dog. That always gets brought up. And then we went to WrestleMania 17. Shane talks about how he struggled to, like, fight his dad. He just really couldn't bring himself to do it. So Shane actually, Vince slaps Shane first. And apparently, like, Shane's eye, like, all swells up. He must have caught him quite good. And from that point on, Shane found it quite easy to go after his dad. And Vince was laughing as he tells the story of how Linda stood up and got this big reaction at WrestleMania. So he kind of looks back really fondly on that. Like, there's a lot of joy, a lot of smiles and whatever around that time. This is something which I think people that are anti-Vince are going to really struggle with, because there are moments where I can't say that it's portraying Vince in a good light, but it's just telling the story of the history of WWE. And it's not painting Vince in really any light. It's just allowing him to kind of tell it from his perspective. And there are times where he is enjoying retelling some of the things that have happened. And, you know, if you're like anti-Vince, you just can't stand him, which I totally understand. Those might be bits that you find quite frustrating. So, like that bit there. Meltzer talks about Sable and the impact of Sable. He says there was times where she was drawing ratings as big as what Stone Cold would. Like 500,000 people would tune in if they heard that she was on TV, right? Apparently she brings a sexual harassment lawsuit against WWE. Vince is asked about it. He says he doesn't remember the details of it. But what he does remember is that Sable returned. Sable came back to WWE. Heyman talks, right? This was weird. So they ask Vince about an affair that he had with Sable. And he gives like a bit of a smile. And you can hear Heyman off camera. He goes, storyline, Vince. Storyline. I don't know what that is about, right? I don't know what that's about. But it was interesting that Heyman is clearly off camera being a bit of I don't know, kind of an overviewer, if you will. Maybe jumping in if he feels like he needs to. It's interesting. I just thought it was really interesting that of all the people that Vince could have had there, it was Heyman. It was Heyman that was there. So I thought that was very interesting. Vince is asked about affairs because he mentioned it in the Playboy magazine interview. He says that he was open and honest. You know, I was open. I was asked a question. I was open. I was honest about it. You know, Vince has only ever truly had one monogamous relationship, and that is with the business, says Paul Heyman. He serves the business with his heart, passion, and life. So really they're saying, you know, he didn't treat Linda great. He cheated on her. He's admitted to it. He's had affairs. And Heyman kind of says, you know, the only person that he's treated with the right level of respect, if you will, the only person he's never cheated on is the business, which in many ways keeps coming across as his first love. You know, his first focus is the business. We move on. WWF goes public in the year 2000. That brings in a lot of money. We see things like a WWF casino opening. I don't think that stays open very long. The restaurant, of course, in New York. That was around for a good few years. And we see WCW is struggling at this point. Since Austin and all of those have risen and the whole Attitude Era has arrived, WWF have once again become market leaders, right? Vince purchases WCW. We see footage of them celebrating on the private plane, which was really cool, on the jet, which I thought was really cool. I haven't seen that footage before. Vince said, I don't get great joy from winning because I just expect to win. The XFL begins now. So this is Vince's football league in the off-season. It's kind of football, but with a WWF flair to it, right? First week of XFL, the ratings were huge, but those ratings fall 75% ultimately. Vince goes on Bob Costas, and it all kicks off, man. So he goes on this show, and Bob Costas is starting to like really grill Vince about XFL and like how much of a failure it is and how the ratings have fallen. Vince said he did his job. He did it well. He got me. And they show footage of like Vince just losing it, basically. He's in the middle of this interview and he's just really like losing it. And Vince is like, he got me. I just can't say anything. He did his job. He did it well. He said, I visualized what it would be like to wrap my hands around his neck, which I thought was, I mean, of all the things to say, you know, Vince saying that he was actually visualizing what it would be like to throttle Bob Costas in that moment. So the XFL, it fails. And around this time, WWF are forced to become WWE because of the World Wildlife Fund. He said, I didn't want to change, but I couldn't do anything about it. Hogan comes back as well. And Vince said, like, he was hurt. But he'll always put the business first and he'll always do what the audience wants. And he felt this was what they wanted. We have a look at Hogan against The Rock from WrestleMania 18. We see Eric Bischoff comes into WWE. Again, kind of playing into that theme of I'll do whatever the audience want me to do. We see that eventually Bret Hart would return as well. But there is a problem, and that is that Stone Cold is frustrated at this point. He's frustrated with the creative. He's hurt as well. He's injured. So he's basically reached the end of the road. The Rock is leaving to go to Hollywood. So WCW have gone. So really this amazing boom period has kind of ended, and they need to go into the next stage. And so this is where we move on to ruthless aggression. We have a look at Cena. We look at his struggles. We look at the rise of Thugonomics. We see that Trish, they're saying around this time, like, there was a bit of pressure to just do what you're told to do. And so Triple H is like, I had to do stuff I didn't want to do. And they show Katie Vick, right? And Trish talks of refusing to make out with a female talent. And she said, just a few weeks later, I lost my title. She said, was I being punished? Maybe. So, you know, there's a bit of pressure around. Things aren't all that great once again, because the future, you know, who's going to take the company forwards? You know, who's got that ruthless aggression? Steph is asked about if there was anything that she ever refused to do, and she says that there was, but she's not going to mention it. But Vince mentions it. He said, I wanted Steph to get pregnant, and I was going to impregnate her, in storyline, of course. That one didn't make it, so Steph like shot that one down. So Steph wouldn't mention what the stories was, but Vince came out with that one. That was one that Steph refused to do. Steph said, my father is different from my boss. He expects results, especially from the family. Vince is tough on Shane and Steph. If your last name is McMahon, you better step the hell up, said Vince. The USA Network executive said she felt that Shane was a little bit of the black sheep of the family. Shane talks about wanting to buy UFC. Right, and this is really interesting because I'd heard that Shane wanted to buy UFC, but we sort of dig into it a little bit. Shane really thought that that was the way to go. So Shane, why don't you take your money and you put into it? It didn't work, and it wouldn't work. It would have took a huge investment. Shane only had a little bit of money, so that wouldn't have been a good investment. So Vince is saying basically it would have took a lot of money. He wasn't prepared to put his money into it. Shane would have had to have put his own money into it, and it was just, it wouldn't have worked. Shane had an idea. He really believed him, and Vince disagreed with it. It escalated fast. Vince said, we're not going to do that whilst I'm alive. Vince also took a knife and said, right here, that's what you're going to have to do to make this decision. If you're going to have to stick that dagger in me. If you don't stick it in me, then I know you're not man enough to do it. Or you could buy me out, the way I brought out my father. If I don't get out of your way, then be prepared to get rid of me. The way I had to get rid of my father when he wasn't doing the things my way. That's a story from Paul Heyman. He observed that conversation between Vince and Shane, which I thought was fascinating. So Shane really wanted to do something, and Vince was like, no, if you want to do it, you're basically going to have to kill me. Here's the knife. Like, do it. You're going to have to do it. If you want it that bad, you're going to have to kill me. Either kill me and do your idea, or I'll know that you're not man enough. I mean, it was, I mean, this is him talking to his son. And he goes on to say, like, you know, I'm not going to basically be easy on you. My dad wasn't easy on me. I think his relationship with his mother, his father, his stepfather, massively shape who Vince becomes. Vince also spoke in regards to UFC about how he was in the show business and that was a sport. And he says, like, it just wasn't really something he was interested in. So Shane left the business about 2009. Shane felt that it was his time to take over. Vince says family businesses can be really difficult. Shane had a different vision for the company, but I wasn't prepared to go anywhere. So we went with my vision. And basically the Janelle Grant lawsuit is teased for the final episode. We're almost there, kids. It's been a hell of a walk. I wanted to get this done within an hour. Right now, I'm hoping we get it in before 2 hours. So this will be one of the longest videos. But, wow, so much stuff. I mean, we're trying to break down a 6-hour, really in-depth Mr. McMahon docuseries. So I am going to just not worry about how long this is, and hopefully people enjoy the beginning, even if they click off after that. I think the first 20 minutes where we do an overview, I think there's some good stuff there. Okay, episode 6. This is called The Finish, right? So Vince starts by saying, I have 2 different brains. They're like computers in my head. Sometimes they work against me. There's one talking to me right now. There's another thinking something completely different. There's a third one sometimes. If I want to tap into it, I could. It's hard for me to focus sometimes. It's bothered me because I just want to fit in. But that's who you are. You've got to deal with it. You're different. Just be different. So I didn't quite understand what he was. I think he's talking about how, like, he's constantly thinking. He's constantly got things going on in his head. He can't just focus on one thing. I think that's kind of what he was trying to say. But it kind of came out as just weird. The guy says, okay, well, what's your other brain thinking about right now? And Vince said, it's involving having a lot of fun and having sex. That was the intro to episode 6. Right, we get this disclaimer. After the allegations become public, Vince McMahon cancels his final interviews for this series. So we skip so much here. I feel like this is just not the documentary they thought it was going to be, because right now we start, this is the last episode. Half an hour of this is going to be about Janelle Grant, right? And we're starting at Battle of the Billionaires. We're only at WrestleMania 23. We've got to fit in everything from WrestleMania 23. I feel like this could have been a 10-part rather than a 6-part, you know? Honestly, they could have done more episodes of this. So, Battle of the Billionaires, Meltzer said it was the biggest pay-per-view audience, ever. I think that's been beaten now. We look at Donald Trump, who was obviously a big fan of pro wrestling, and we look at, his campaigning and how it's got connections to pro wrestling and the promos that he cuts and everything. And we look at the Vince character being killed off with the limo exploding. And I think, was it Meltzer? Someone said that they heard that Donald Trump had actually called in to check that Vince was okay. He saw the limo exploding on the show, and he wanted to know if Vince was all right. But it was just a storyline. And we move on to Chris Benoit, right? Because it is literally around that time, a few days later, that the Chris Benoit tragedy happens. So Vince speaks about Benoit. He said, as far as we knew, Chris was a great guy, right? As far as we knew. And this is weird. He says there's no correlation between steroids and what happened to Chris Benoit. Human beings are flawed. Chris went nuts. It happens in every form of life and everything. That's all that I can take away from it. I think the question must have been, what can you take away from the Chris Benoit tragedy? And that was his answer. We're then introduced to Chris Nowinski, who is a neuroscientist and a former WWE superstar. So I was certain by the way that he wrestled that he probably had CTE. So this is Chris talking about Benoit, right? Benoit's brain, when we did see it, was the worst I had ever seen. Vince says it is a ridiculous statement of why Benoit did this, saying that it was due to trauma to the head. He said, everything we do is a complete work. Vince is adamant that there was no trauma to Chris Benoit's head because they're not actually doing these moves. So in Vince's mind, Chris Benoit didn't suffer trauma to the head repeatedly because he wasn't actually going out there doing headbutts. But obviously the truth is there's going to be times where you do, the heads do, connect. And, over, even if they're not the hardest shots, over years and years and years, day after day after day, even those little shots, I'm sure, are going to, build up. The damage is going to build up. But I thought that was a really interesting line from Vince. He said, Looks like damage, but there's not. So, you know, it looks like we're doing these moves, but we're not. Stone Cold also said, look, I'm just not a CTE guy. I just don't believe in it. So even Stone Cold is not convinced by the damage to the brain argument. Even he's not sold on that. But this Chris Nowinski said CTE is a disease that you can see under the microscope, right? But around this time, believe it or not, Vince did reach out to Chris Nowinski. He wanted to learn because there was a lot of bad press around at the time. I think Vince probably felt like he didn't believe in it, but he had to be seen to be doing something about it, right? Because obviously it was like nationwide, international news. So he reaches out to this Chris Nowinski, and basically there's no more chair shots, and there's like loads of changes that come into WWE, like the whole wellness policy and all of that sort of stuff gets reviewed and everything. There's still negative publicity, and we actually move on to wrestlers dying young. Fans knew that these guys were dying. They didn't care, or at least they didn't seem to, says Phil Mushnick. Phil Mushnick saying that fans just weren't bothered, that a lot of their favorite stars were dying. They just, you know, replaced them with someone else, which I thought was a bit heartless from Phil Mushnick. I don't believe that was the fans' attitude, but that's what he said. Vince said he went on Armian Ketinian. I've never heard of that person. And again, just like before, this is another interview that goes wrong. So he goes on talking about wrestlers dying young, and it just goes wrong. He said, when someone comes at me, I get defensive, but then I go offensive. And again, more clips showing Vince just going off, right? If you look back at a lot of these performers, they passed away. It's because they are using prescription drugs as recreational drugs. Many took these pills to feel good. It was a horrible cocktail, says Vince. So Vince says that's why the wrestlers died as young as they did. That's the reason for it. It's because they were taking these prescription drugs as recreational drugs, and they were taking them to make themselves feel good. I think it's a bit more complex than that. If you speak to the wrestlers, because of the schedule, they needed pills to sleep. But then you needed pills when you woke up to feel awake. And that is then the slippery slope, basically. Basically, to deal with that life, you find yourself self-medicating. That's certainly what I've heard wrestlers saying. So there could be some truth in that, but the reasons why they get onto the drugs wasn't really explored, right? Meltzer says, you know, as a result of like Benoit and stuff, there was a reduced schedule. They started monitoring concussions and drug use. There was gigantic changes around this time. Then we talk about the streak ending, because the streak comes to an end. And obviously the Undertaker suffers a concussion in that match. Has to go to the hospital after. And Vince goes in the ambulance and goes to the hospital, right? Vince said it was a last-minute decision to end the streak, and he said that it was quite traumatic for Mark Calloway to kind of deal with that decision. And he says, I don't see, when I watch WrestleMania 30, I don't see where Mark was concussed. It could have happened. I think Mark doesn't remember, to be honest. It was just so traumatic for him. That's, in my mind, that's an amazing moment, because Vince is basically saying that he doesn't believe that The Undertaker was concussed at WrestleMania 30. That's basically what he's saying. He's saying that he thinks it was the trauma of losing. That is why he can't remember things. It was the trauma of the streak coming to an end. But I mean, I don't believe that. I think it was a concussion, and Undertaker doesn't seem to be in any doubt about that. That's the first time I've ever heard Vince come out with that. Like, that blew my mind, to be honest. Obviously, the wellness policy we spoke about, TVPG. That's where we go to. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction from the fans around this point. So we're going from ruthless aggression into TVPG. We're talking about the women's evolution. I mean, we're really jumping. We were doing WrestleMania 23 not that long ago. Now we're around WrestleMania 32. I mean, we've just jumped like a good 9 years or so. And Shane is coming back in 2016 as well. Shane actually gets upset. Shane, I think, comes across really well in this documentary. He comes across as a really nice guy. And he gets upset at how much it meant to him. The crowd giving him that reaction. He said he's got goosebumps just thinking about it now. And this is kind of where we're touching back on the Shane and Vince relationship again. I forgot that Vince had swore in that promo to Shane. Like when Shane comes back and he makes the match Shane Undertaker at WrestleMania 32, he's cutting this promo and he drops like the F word in there. And yeah, I'd forgot he had done that. Shane keeps saying that he was just trying to prove himself to Vince. And also, like, during that match, we see Vince talking to the commentary team, and you can hear Vince saying something, and then you can hear the commentators saying the exact same lines. So I thought that was really interesting footage. WrestleMania 32 footage. Vince said he's always been proud of Shane for what he does and what he attempts to do. He gives it his all. And then you see Vince and Shane after the match embracing backstage. And I'd seen that footage before. And again, you know, Shane gets emotional. And apparently he said to Vince, that's all I ever wanted was your respect. And I think this is meant to be a nice moment, to be honest. I think this is meant to be part of what could have been the original ending for this. It kind of felt like they really do focus on the last two episodes on the Shane and Vince relationship. And now we've got this lovely moment where they're embracing backstage at WrestleMania 32. So we've got that. We get a load of wrestlers saying that they see Vince as a father figure. Undertaker says he'll take a bullet for him. Shane said that he did envisage carrying on the family business, right? And Tony Atlas said, look, Shane is a really nice guy. Steph, you wouldn't want to mess with her. So they're kind of talking about what's going to happen after Vince has gone. Obviously, at this point, we don't know what's coming, right? We talk about the WWE Network. We talk about the Peacock deal. AEW are very briefly shown as like new competitors emerge. And there is a shot of AEW briefly. We see Roman Reigns, right? Vince talks about how there's lots of succession plans. And he says that he doesn't ever see himself retiring. Shawn Michaels, Hogan, Cena, they all agree they don't see Vince retiring. Booker T said, what will it take for Vince to retire? A nuclear bomb exploding, which is a lovely segue then into the nuclear bomb that does explode. The nuclear bomb, which is the whole Janelle Grant situation and the hush money and all of that. So out of 6 hours, right, we've covered about 5.5. There's just half an hour now left to cover. And this is all the stuff that we know. So, right, Janelle Grant. So Vince resigns as CEO, right? Because obviously there's all the hush money payments and all the kind of sexual assault kind of allegations and the NDAs and all of that comes out. So Vince resigns as CEO, but he stays on the board. They show Vince on Raw and SmackDown and the crowd cheering him, right? Vince cancels future interviews, right, when all of this happens. At this point, it's where we look back at like a tanning salon allegation of Vince groping someone that worked in a tanning salon back in 2006. There is hush money deals of $12 million to 4 women. Apparently 7.5 million is to an ex-female wrestler who was coerced into oral sex. Vince actually retires at this point. So he had resigned as CEO, but now he outright retires. Steph actually is shown in the ring starting a thank you Vince chant, right? Without Vince, I don't think it will work anymore, Hogan says back in 2022. He's talking about like WWE surviving. Hogan doesn't think it will survive without Vince. Vince returns as executive chairman, right? So you might not remember the timeline because I couldn't quite remember the timeline, but basically he he's told to go, right? He's told to retire. I think you should retire. Like all this noise, all this stuff that's coming out, I think it's best you retire. He retires. I think it was a tweet that he had put out where he retires, but he didn't really want to go. And he eventually gets a bit bored, and he eventually just comes back. So he comes back as executive chairman, and he comes back because he wants to explore a sale. He wants to look at selling WWE, of course. What was interesting was the board of WWE, they unanimously voted that he should not return. And what's interesting is Triple H and Steph are on that board. That means that they definitely voted that he should not return. But he still returned anyway because he had the power. When Vince comes back, Stephanie resigns, right? Vince says he never should have gone and that he had bad advice from someone close to him. That's what Meltzer claims. And obviously, Stephanie goes at this point. So it's probably not a leap to suggest that it was Stephanie that had advised Vince to walk away, right? Which he regretted and then ended up coming back. We see this amazing clip of Paul Heyman saying to Stephanie, you know he's put you in a position in life where you battle him. You know that, right? It's in Gorilla, right? It's like we're not meant to see it. And Steph said it sure feels that way. And she starts laughing. I couldn't quite tell. Like, it's out of context. Like, I don't know the rest of it, but it's an interesting little clip. It kind of feels like we weren't meant to see it. Bruce Pritchard said that he has no idea what happened with Steph leaving, and basically no one else does either. So any chatter about why she left, that's just people speculating, basically. WWE are sold to Endeavor at this point. Meltzer says it was too big to stay a family business at this point. Business is really good. We got the Netflix deal around this time. And they asked Bruce Pritchard at this point, have you watched any of the episodes that we've made? I think they must have done like episode 1, episode 2, episode 3 of this series, made them available to people in WWE. Bruce says yes, he had watched some of the early episodes and he thought they sucked. He says, I think they're gotcha pieces. It's like, how can we make Vince look bad? And they're like, well, what's missing? What have we not done? And he's like, well, you've not shown the human side of Vince. Like, you've not shown the Vince that helped my wife get the best medical care that was possible. And he tells a story about how his wife needed medical care and Vince made sure she got the best. And he's like, you never showed any of that. You haven't shown the human side. And of course, just as he says that, bang, here's the Janelle Grant lawsuit now. We go straight into the Janelle Grant lawsuit. And really at this bit, there's not really much to talk about because this is where it's the texts and it's that paperwork and it's like, you know, it's the whole lawsuit. It's, I think, probably the most shocking part of all of this because it's the bit that's got all the details in of what he was alleged to have done. And Vince resigns. This is where Vince goes. And he's never come back since. You know, at this point, he's sold the company to Endeavor. He's no longer in control. He's no longer got the power. And so he's kind of pushed out. And he resigns. He walks away. They do mention that Brock is mentioned in the lawsuit. They do mention that. They also touch on the Ashley Mazzano rape, right? Where this was tribute to the troops. And a soldier or soldiers are alleged to have raped her. And it's also revealed that she allegedly claimed that there had been sexual advances from Vince that had been made as well. Vince is someone that goes on to... So we don't stay on that any longer. Vince goes on to sell his shares. That's noted. WWE are thriving at the moment. That's noted. And that's really where we are. I mean, like, Vince has gone. He's sold his shares. The lawsuit is still yet to be heard. So really, it sort of just ends there. So the final bit is the bit that I put up on social media. So it's just this final couple of moments It's this clip here, this 1 minute 36. This is how it ends. And it's Vince talking about his legacy. So they say Vince's legacy, what is it? Undertaker, Trish, Cena, Booker T, none of them can answer it. None of them know what Vince's legacy is now. But Tony Atlas does. Tony Atlas said, well, I think he's the greatest promoter of all time. That's what I think his legacy is. Dave Meltzer says he's the most important person in wrestling history. In his prime, a creative genius, but by far a saint. Like, you know, trying to kind of say he did all this great stuff, but, you know, he was certainly no saint. The real lesson of Vince is that life isn't good and bad. So it's funny because Vince has spent his life presenting good guys and bad guys, but Vince is neither. You know, he is a mixture because there are plenty of people that he has helped in life. You know, Undertaker talks about how he would take a bullet for Vince, and Bruce Pritchard gets very upset about the fact that this feels like they have kind of tried to get Vince and it's a gotcha piece, you know? So there's people that love Vince, but I mean, you can't ignore the allegations. You can't ignore, I mean, and they don't. I mean, they do touch on all the scandals and they do go through like the Janelle Grant stuff. So, I mean, all of that is highlighted. So, but most important person in wrestling history, and this is Vince. Vince said, what's my legacy? I don't have one. This was Vince in 2021. What's my legacy? I don't have one. And they then just used like clips from other time periods. He refers to himself as an egomaniac, a physical culturist, sexually active, psychologically challenged, a paradox of paradoxes. He talks about how individuals can end up becoming their characters. And Vince says that he wonders if that has happened to him. And if one is maybe a little exaggerated than the other. Is he like a bit bigger than his character, or is his character a bit bigger than him? And he says he doesn't know which one is which. I sort of feel like the final bit has had to be cobbled together, to be honest with you. It feels like it's been cobbled together because he hasn't done any interviews in recent years, so they need to kind of find an ending. So I feel like they found some old Vince interviews and they found clips of him saying stuff, and they've kind of tried to put something together. So if you get a chance to watch the ending, I've put that up on my social media. I think it paints a picture of him being very complex, a paradox of paradoxes. And that is it. I mean, that is everything. We've kind of gone through all of the episodes. I've kind of given you some of the key quotes, key stories, the talking points. I mean, we have done 2 hours here, which is, I mean, my voice is giving up. But yeah, overall, I give it an 8.5. I think it is well worth a watch. But I'll be very interested to see what people think about this. Very interested. I think that it is frustrating at times. And there are definitely reactions that I would have liked to have seen from Vince at different points that I don't see. But I do think it's quite balanced. I didn't come away from it feeling like Vince is this lovely, warm person. I came away from it feeling like he is heartless and cold. But that's what I thought when I went into it. So it didn't change my opinion of him. I was uncomfortable about him before. I'm uncomfortable about him now. And all the scandals are there. They're mentioned. There's people in this documentary that really don't like Vince, like Phil Mushnick, really don't like Vince. And so there is kind of, and Dave Meltzer goes in quite a bit. So there is counterbalance as well. So I think, for me, I think they've done a good job on this. But I'll be really interested to see what other people think. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was long. I know it was, my voice knows it was long. But yeah, really good. Really enjoyable. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.